On behalf of Women's Tech Forum, a very warm welcome and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Susie Gleason and I'm proud to be one of the founding members of WTF. We are excited to bring you the first in a new series of masterclasses we are planning to run over the coming months. Up until now, we've typically hosted events at industry conferences such as ITW, PTC and Capacity Europe. But since our world is shifting, we recognize we needed to shift our approach to stay connected with you. And since our normal events are likely off for a while, we are incredibly excited to bring you this new forum. For those of you who are new, welcome. WTF came about when 4 friends got together back in 2017 at PTC, and amongst other things, we talked about the glaring gender gap in our industry. We wondered how many women at that conference actually knew each other and what we could do to help change that. 4 years later, we are now a community 900 strong and growing. We thank each of you for helping to make that happen. In addition to myself, our board members are Sarah, Elena, Jessica, and Nadia. As many of you know, our dear friend and co-founder Bryn Fowler passed away last October after her battle with colon cancer. She was 38 years old and we miss her every day. In her name and in her memory, we will continue the work she was deeply passionate about, and we look forward to doing that with all of you. Our goal is to help connect the women in our industry, to create a safe and open environment to support and encourage each other, and to build long-lasting relationships, and have a little fun along the way. And it's thanks to you and our sponsors who help make this happen. This year's 2020 sponsors are AECOM, CloudScene, CoreSite, Digital Realty, Equinix, Facebook, Google, Netflix, and Rogers. Thank you all. Today, we are thrilled to bring you a masterclass on resiliency, which is hosted by Audrey Epstein and Linda Adams from the Trispective Group, who will guide us through the best practices and methods to stay resilient during times of stress and feeling overwhelmed, which I'm sure we can all relate to. Both Audrey and Linda are professional leadership coaches and have spent the last 10 plus years focused on their passion, which is creating capabilities in leaders, teams, and organizations. In 2017, they published their first book, The Loyalist Team, How Trust, Candor, and Authenticity Creates Great Teams. And the great news is that everybody attending today's session will receive a link to a copy of the book. Finally, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. Please be engaged and stay focused. There's a lot of great content and we don't want you to miss it. And we have a few polls thrown in there for good measure. Throughout the webinar, you can submit your questions using Q&A button on the right-hand side of the platform. And with that, I'll hand it over to Linda and Audrey. Over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Susie. My name is Audrey Epstein. I'm here with my partner, Linda, and we're thrilled to be here to talk about resiliency. I feel really lucky almost every day in my job as a leadership and team coach. I get to work with wonderful, strong, successful leaders who have entrusted me to help them grow in some way, to work on getting unstuck, to help them build better teams, to figure out what they want to do next in their lives. And oftentimes, with change, with growth, can come some emotion. I am used to emotion and dealing with that in the workplace. However, in the past couple of months, I have seen a range and intensity, the size of emotional responses in my clients and in myself has been more than I could have ever anticipated. And I can't think of a better time to cover this topic of resiliency. I think it's something we are all struggling with and thinking about right now. So really thrilled to be here. Next slide. Here's how we're going to cover this topic. First, I want to go through the objectives. We want to start by looking at a little bit of our brain biology. We want to understand how stress impacts us and why we are wired to avoid threat and how that is impacting us every day. Then we're going to talk about personal resiliency and positivity. We'll look at some of the research and science on those topics. We'll talk about best practices for how do we build positivity and what does that mean. Then we'll spend a few minutes on how do we help others. We're surrounded by folks day in, day out right now. We're trying to help our family, our coworkers. How do we help lead them through change? And then we'll talk about personal next steps and actions. That's also the agenda that we will follow. As Susie mentioned, we'll do a couple of live polling questions along the way, and we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end because we really want to hear from you. Next slide. So another way to think about how we have built this program, we have built this program in the same way that you build emotional intelligence, and that's from the bottom up. I know many of you have learned about emotional intelligence, at least in some way, which is that study of how do we both understand our emotions and understand what makes us tick, what sets us off, and then learn how to manage our emotions. How do we get ourselves up for the game when we really don't want to and re-engage? How do we show up as our best self? How do we delay the gratification of giving into our emotions when that's not the best approach for us to take? From there, we can then understand others' emotions, activate our empathy, read the room, know organizational politics, and then finally, we can learn how to build relationships and really connect emotionally with others, understand how to influence others, how to coach and develop others, how to get others to, do what we need them to do in the workplace. But we've learned in studying emotional intelligence, we don't get to start at the top of the pyramid. We have to start from the bottom. And I'll give you my own little personal reason why that is. So have you ever gotten feedback from someone on something that they absolutely stink in? I know I have, and I know what happens to me. I do a little eye roll, and it goes in one ear and out the other because they don't have any credibility. Don't tell me not to, go into the details or talk so much when I see you doing that all the time, or whatever the situation is. So we have to have self-awareness first before we can build strong connections with others. In fact, research would show that if you have high self-awareness, you have a 50-50 shot of being good at building connection and relationships. If you have low self-awareness, that number goes to 5%. So that's how we want you to engage in this seminar, in this webinar that we're doing right now. We want you to start with yourself. We're going to talk about what makes us tick and how we're wired first. And even though I know you have people around you that you might want to think about for this program, I really want you to use yourself and not make it an external intellectual exercise, but instead really engage emotionally. Next slide. So thank you to over 75 of you who filled out our pre-session survey. We asked you 7 multiple choice questions and then a few open answers. And I want to share with you what the results were. We asked you on a scale of 1 to 5, from poor to excellent, to rate your resiliency and stress and positivity. And what you see here in the results are the positive responses. So those that answered 4 or 5, meaning good or excellent. And here were the questions. How would you rate your resiliency before the pandemic? Then we asked, how would you rate your resiliency now? How do you think you're doing in handling stress today? How productive do you think you are today? How positive are you today? And then we asked about others. So others around you, family, friends, and coworkers, how well are they doing at handling stress? And then what's your optimism for the future? So as you can see in the results, our resiliency has taken a hit. We are not feeling as clear right now in terms of how we can stay productive and focused and positive and be happy and manage our stress. And what is really interesting to me is that we are also saying well, I might not be doing so well, but others around me, they're doing even worse. And I think that's important because, as we'll look at a little bit later on in the session, how others around us are responding is impacting us every single day. And we have to learn what we're going to do about that. Please go to the next slide. So we also asked you 4 open-ended questions. The first one was, what are you managing to do right now that you didn't think was possible 2 months ago? And these are the summarized top 5 answers that we saw overwhelmingly. So working at home while also taking care of my kids. I'm actually getting regular exercise for the first time. I'm being more productive. I'm managing my time surprisingly well. I'm also spending more time on work, and I'm finding some time for hobbies or even personal development. What's one surprise for you about your own capability? That I've been able to increase my productivity and efficiency, that I'm more resilient, positive, and optimistic than I thought I would be. When I thought or worried about the future, it's actually better than I thought. I'm actually more creative. I'm doing things that I didn't know I could do prior and making shifts in how I work and in my product and output that seemed impossible prior. I'm adapting, I'm more organized, and I've actually built some even stronger relationships. What's most stressful for you? Overwhelmingly, the uncertainty, whether that's about job, income, economy, the virus, the world. We don't have answers right now. We're worried about our children. How do we help them cope? How do we make sure that they're learning? How do we get it all done? We're also worried about our increased workloads. Many people are working harder than they ever have, and finding ways to separate out the work life from the other things that are important to us in our life is difficult. And then not being able to see families. The number of people said hugs. Not getting hugs and being able to hug the ones we love is incredibly stressful for us. And then finally, we asked, what's the most useful tip or tool for you that's helped you to be productive? And number one are schedules and routines and figuring out what's important and letting go of the rest. Setting boundaries from work and personal time. I think many people spent the first several weeks working non-stop until they recognized that they only had themselves to make those boundaries. That we have to find and be really creative in our ways of connecting with folks, even if we can't do that physically. To limit our exposure to the news, that the 24-hour news cycle is not healthy for us. And then finally, taking steps for personal wellness. And what's really interesting about all of these is they have both psychology and science to back them all up. And we're going to talk about all of them and why they're important in some way. And what this says to me is that although when asked in a quantitative way, how are you feeling about your resiliency? We said not that great. We actually have put lots in place and have done more than we thought capable of. And I think that's pretty powerful. Next slide. In fact, what's really interesting is that globally, women heads of state are disproportionately represented right now as the top leaders in proactively and productively managing the pandemic, which I find fascinating. And there hasn't been enough research or time yet to state with any clarity why that is. But early inklings really point to that these women all have a few common traits. One is that they are really strong listeners and they're very good learners. They use expertise, they use their humility to understand what they know and what they don't know, and they activate their empathy to understand the impact on others. And then the next piece is that they take action quickly, so that they really marry this idea of I'm going to learn and listen, and then I'm going to take action for the greater good, not based on my ego needs. Next slide. In fact, this reminded me of a study that was undertaken in 2019. It was a global study on leaders. And what they did in this study is they asked executives to rate the leaders who were their direct reports on 20 different really important leadership capabilities. And what they found is that the women direct reports outperformed the male direct reports in 18 of these 20 capabilities. And I think if they had focused the questions differently, like if they had said, in general, who's better at this, men or women, we would see different results. But in the way that they did it, this is the result that they found. And I think these top 5 that I've highlighted have a lot to do with the world leaders that we've seen and a lot to do with the ways in which we can activate our own resiliency. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Linda, who's going to start in the first content segment.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I appreciate so many of you showing up to really learn and explore a topic that we know is important to all of us. And as Audrey had suggested, I really want for you to think about this in terms of you, yourself, and what you can glean from this and what practices you might take going forward. And then from there, you'll be able to help other people. But let's put ourselves number 1 to start with. Let's talk for a moment about what's happening with the brain. So we could show the brain slide, please. So we like to think however smart we are, we can think our way through any single issue or challenge that we have. But what we know from basic brain biology is that we can be hijacked by our brains. Without even thinking through a situation, our brains are already firing. And what they're firing on is that little organ there called the amygdala. It's part of the lizard brain. It's very close to the brain stem, so a very primitive part of the brain. And it's a threat filter that is always on. It's gauging whether or not we're safe or whether a situation is unsafe. It's the place where our emotional memories are stored. And the reason it's there is for our survival. We are the product of eons upon eons of generations who have well-developed amygdalas. And the amygdala itself can really only ask or answer one of 2 questions. And the questions are, does this kill me or do I kill it? And it can react very, very quickly, as you see here, in 30 milliseconds. The larger part of our brain, our thinking brain in the neocortex, is where our intelligence is housed, our ability to engage with complex thought and to be able to work through situations that may be very sophisticated. The challenge here is our thinking brain can only analyze that input and determine whether a threat is present in 250 milliseconds. So it's taking significantly longer than the amygdala to tell us whether we're safe or not. So when the amygdala kicks in, what it does is trigger that flight or fight response to us. Our heart rates become raised, our blood pressure increases, and stress hormones start to be released, and our emotions are in control. And the thinking brain really has a challenge because it's now being overridden by that flight or fight response. Now, the good news is we'll get to a place where we can talk about how our thinking brains can overcome those emotions. But when that threat is perceived, as you see here, our heart rates do increase. And what causes that, or what allows for that to happen, is for blood flow to increase to large muscles. So to our upper arms, where we're getting ready to punch someone out, or to our thighs, where we're getting ready to take off and run away from it. Cortisol and adrenaline levels increase, and we become really focused on what it is we need to do, either to get out from that situation, to survive it, or what we need to do to win. And while all of that is increasing, on the flip side, because blood flow is being shifted to our muscles, blood flow to the brain is decreasing. Our ability to access complex thought and have many options goes away, and our rational behavior goes out of the window. And that's why after an event, and it's about 20 minutes that a hijack can last for, we ask ourselves, why did I do that? Why did I say that? It's because logic and rational behavior has absolutely gone out the window. So let's take a look at what those triggers can be on this next slide. There's basically 3 different types of triggers. The first are those that are real physical threats. And generally before this pandemic, I've talked about physical threats, oftentimes in a very academic way, because it's rare that we genuinely feel physically threatened. But today, that is simply not the case. There are lots of physical threats around us. And if a global pandemic isn't enough for you to feel physically threatened, then how about murder hornets? I mean, where did that come from? So we have some real physical threats that are triggers for us today. The second set of threats come as social threats. And social threats can be interpreted quite simply as being talked over or dismissed or not considered. And again, in this current environment, those social threats are much more prevalent. It's really difficult on a Zoom call to not at times talk over each other. It's impossible to read body language. And if someone is wearing a mask, as we're often asked to do now, it's really difficult to pick up those cues that can help us diffuse that sense of social threat. And then if those two aren't enough, a third trigger can be in the space of worry, those threats that we imagine. And our brains are in overdrive. I don't know about you, whether you have the 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning wake-up call, where you really start to worry, and our brains just don't seem to be able to slow down. Now, the problem is we're notoriously bad at predicting how we will feel in the future or how we're going to respond to a situation tomorrow. But the worries we have are often very, very real. And I hear about this from colleagues and clients all the time. An aging or sick parent, will we get to see them again? How do I homeschool my kids and do my job? What if I get fired? I've been furloughed, and how am I going to pay my bills? I'm not feeling well right now. Are these allergies, or is this the virus? In fact, as I go through all of this right now, I got to tell you, I'm feeling kind of triggered myself. So I'd like to ask you, if we can go to the next slide and open up the poll, to talk about or to think about what's been triggering you lately. There are 6 areas there, and I'd ask for you to respond to which one of those 6 has been most triggering to you. So I do know, and research tells me, that we spend over 90% of our time imagining the future or replaying the past. And neither of those is particularly healthy for our emotional state. And I've mentioned a number of things that I've heard that trigger the people around me that they're dealing with right now. And some of them come from good news. A colleague shared with me, my spouse is going back to work, which is great. But I've got 3 kids at home and I'm expected to work full time. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I've had someone share with me that they were getting ready to talk to their spouse about divorce, but with shelter in place, they can't move out. And then we have kids who are graduating from high school and college, and they're not going to get the experiences that we may have shared when we were at those times. So let's take a look at and what we're seeing on the poll. Very interesting. So worry is 26% top of the list. So I hope by running through the number of triggers that I've been hearing about, I haven't contributed to those worries. But you see there that with your colleagues, those people in this webinar, we have all of these emotions present to us today. And these are really pandemic triggers. So we have an opportunity right now, even in this environment, to think about how we're going to manage our triggers. So we know that when we do get triggered, it really does have an impact on our physical health. Loneliness and isolation that we may be experiencing during this pandemic is as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's pretty bad. People that we have generally gone to, who have been our advisors or our friends, our mentors, our assistants, our aides, people who get us through our tough times, they're triggering at the same time. And when we need to be able to disengage and just get away from it, we can't do that because we're stuck at this time of pandemics. So we've been trying to get some more information in detail. Let's take a look at the next slide around understanding what is present for people in today's environment. One of the partners that we have is New Measures, and they focus on employee engagement. They conducted a survey just recently. The results came out only last week. where we approached 96 HR leaders and asked them what they were hearing from their employees in terms of their initial concerns. And the chart that you see here highlights the top concerns. And what I'll point out is that every one of these potential triggers falls into each of the three categories that I talked about. So physical threat, social threat, and imagined or worried threat. So we definitely are not alone in what we are dealing with and how we are feeling and engaging with the world around us during this pandemic. But I do have some good news, and that shows up on the next slide. And that's a way for us to think about how we can stop these hijacks. The first thing is to really be aware of what your triggers are. Are there things that will happen in your everyday life, things that you will see, things that you will engage with that will cause you to trigger? And I think once you have some sense, I know that once you have some sense of what those triggers are, we can become aware of them and perhaps engage in catch and release. Be able to say, I know this is a problem, but I'm not going to deal with it right now. The next one is to listen to your body. And for me, when I know when I'm being hijacked, I get this heat that rushes from my shoulders up through the back of my head. And that lets me know that my amygdala has gone into overdrive. And it gives me an opportunity to really start to explore whether or not this hijack is valuable and real and whether I need to engage with it. So figure out what your physical response is to a hijack. And then if you're able to just simply breathe, research shows that this absolutely slows down the heart rate. It allows you to be more present and gives you a place where it actually slows down the chemical flow of adrenaline or cortisol. So just breathe, count to 10, imagine and enjoy the space around you. Just take a moment. For me, one of the big tools I have in my arsenal to stop hijacks is to be able to ask questions. I call it my cortex question. The question that the amygdala cannot ask or answer. So if you're able to, again, think about your triggers and think about a situation where you may actively be in hijack mode, what is a question that you can prepare in advance to ask yourself that will allow you to step back from that trigger? So examples of this might be to consider, why is this person reacting this way? To be able to think about, why do you feel this way, and how or when have you experienced this feeling in the past, and what have you done to be able to get over it? If you can, take a break. As I mentioned, a hijack can last up to 20 minutes. If you can just simply take a break, step back from the call, step away from the phone, step away from the computer, step away from the interaction, take a break, 20 minutes, and you'll find yourself in a better place to be able to deal with your hijack. If you're able to have a sense of appreciation or gratitude, that too calms the brain down and takes you to a much more positive place. And if you can come at a situation where what is your passion, what is your purpose, what is your goal, and for it to be positive, you'll be able to move in that direction and move away from the hijack. And then rehearse. You know you're going to be in a triggering situation, play it through in your head. How will you respond? How will you respond? And then always practice, practice, practice. We're around people right now who love us and care for us. These are often the best people, the best audience we have to practice with. Our kids did not wake up this morning and figure out how they were going to piss us off intentionally. The same thing is true for our partners. So take time to practice and move away from that space of being hijacked. And then think of self-talk, positive self-talk. We speak to others at a rate of 150 to 200 words per minute. And yet when we engage in self-talk, it's more like 1,300 words per minute. That's the potential for 50,000 negative thoughts every single day. So I would really encourage you to be positive and shift that self-talk to positive space. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to talk about positivity.
Thanks, Linda. And the last thing we can do to really address our hijacks is to focus on positivity. The field of positive psychology has really taken off in the past 20 to 30 years with research in many of the major universities, and some of the most popular classes on college campuses right now are on positivity and happiness. And this occurred because researchers started to realize that the opposite of hijacking is not necessarily positivity. It just means that you're not stressed, and that actually there are some different things that make some people more positive, more engaged, and happier in their lives. It's not just the absence of hijacking. And to get into that, we have to know a little bit about what makes us positive. So the one thing that is clear is that to become more positive, you cannot say to yourself, "We'll just be happier." Put on a happy face. In fact, research would say that focusing on being more positive is a sure way to get yourself feeling less positive. Like the last thing we need is one more pressure on us. So what I want to take you through is what are practices that we can use that will help us to become more positive. So step one, we have to understand what makes up our happiness. So research has shown that there's a genetic component to our happiness or our positivity set point that makes up about 50% of that. And this typically isn't that surprising to people. What is surprising are the other two numbers, that our external circumstances actually make up 10% of our long-term positivity and happiness, and our thoughts, attitudes, and actions are the other 40%. What this means is that we have 40% that we can absolutely play around with, focus on, work on if we want to change our positivity and our happiness. Now, like, I recognize the poll that we took at the beginning of this in terms of like our positivity has taken a bump right now. And so our circumstances have a temporary impact, good or bad, but not the long-lasting one. In fact, if we believe that our external circumstances are going to create our happiness, we're going to have a lot of challenge in our lives. If we think happiness is on the other side of the next promotion, making more money, the next relationship, the next job, better grades, it's too elusive. And as soon as we get there, we then set an even higher goal for ourselves that keeps us from ever being happy. Next slide. There is a psychiatrist and very prolific author named Viktor Frankl, who I find amazingly inspirational. And the reason his words are so inspirational is he's a Holocaust survivor, spent time in several concentration camps, including Auschwitz, and then went on to write dozens of books on the meaning of life. And I just want to read you these two quotes. "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Now, I would be lying if I said I live this every day. I don't. But when I am feeling my most whiny, my most victim-y, my most petty, I try to remember that 40% that I can impact. Next slide. So if we can't just say to ourselves, be more positive, what can we practice in order to be more positive? So I'm going to go through some of the practices that we can have that have been absolutely proven to have high correlation with changing our positivity set point. I'd love for you to complete the poll as I go through these of which one of these do you think you should be practicing right now that could impact you. The first one is gratitude. Linda already talked about this, but there have been numerous studies on giving to others is more fulfilling than giving to ourselves. I know that there's been a ton written on self-care, and I want a pedicure maybe more than anyone else right now, but yet study after study have shown that giving a gift to others actually impacts the positive chemical reaction in our brain for a longer period of time than our own self-care or new pair of shoes. The next is connection to others. This is challenging during these times. We have to be more creative in how we connect to others right now, because we can't just go over to their homes or get on an airplane. And yet connection to others is probably the most powerful way to increase your positivity. This is true for introverts as well as extroverts. And for introverts right now, this is hard, because you are not going to just bump into people in the office. You have to actually set up a call, set up a time to meet with people and to connect in a way that can be challenging. Third, Linda already talked about connection to purpose. We feel better when we do things that have meaning to us. And there's this phrase of do what you love and love what you do. And the idea of that is we can find purpose in more than we think. So I'll give you an example. I own my own business, and I tell myself a story that I hate sales and that I can't do sales and that I will feel like, some kind of used car person. That's what I have in my brain if I'm selling. But when I change that story to my purpose is to help others to grow, develop, and explore their potential, and I turn a sales call into that, I feel very empowered and very engaged. Connection to strength. We spend too much time focusing on what we don't do well. Many of you have probably taken Strengths Finders or some other tool. Know what your core strengths are and try to find some way of engaging in those every single day, at least for a little while. So whether that's you have a strength in vision or enthusiasm or analysis, try to figure out some time spent in doing what you do really well. There are way too many studies about the connection between physical activity and mental and emotional health. I'm sure you've seen some of them, but we need that. We need those endorphins in our lives. And then finally, even a little bit, studies have shown even 2 minutes of meditation can make a difference in someone's positivity. And here is why. Focusing on noticing your breathing and then seeing where your thoughts go, and then going back to your breathing and seeing where your thoughts go, gives you so much data about your self-talk. Are you spending that time worrying about the future, or what I like to call awfulizing, which is something I'm pretty good at as a mom? Are you spending time replaying a conversation that you had in the past? And trying to be present just for a little bit of time and just focus on your breathing can change your brain biology just a little bit. So, and there are so many cool tools out there right now that can help you in meditation. Lots of free apps, even 2 minutes a day of guided meditation. And so people are thinking that the top 2 that they could work on right now are gratitude and empathy and physical activity. And I would highly recommend even 10 minutes of exercise a day has been proven to be effective. Next slide. So another reason that we have to think about positivity is that our emotions are contagious. We have these lovely mirror neurons in our brains, and we take a very short period of time before our brain waves, our breathing, our respiration, our heart rates, and our emotions match those around us. It's why whenever I work with leaders, I talk about your moods are contagious. The way you enter a room matters in terms of what you're going to get out of it. This is so powerful that, when we used to go to live sporting events, we felt as if we were playing the game. It's why we get into it so much, or that why intellectually, while we know the TV show, the book, the movie is not real, our emotions are fully encapsulated by what we're seeing on the screen. So I want you to just think about who's influencing you every day, and how are you letting them influence, and are their moods impacting you in a way that is not productive for you? Now, we can't get away from people who are in our house, but we can do a couple of things. One, we can have a conversation with them around what we need and what we would like, and we can ask for that directly because many of us don't do that. And secondly, we can monitor our self-talk, and we can focus on not letting it impact us in the way that it is right now. We don't have to be fully victims to that. Secondly, you got to think about what input you're seeking. And how you're monitoring the messages you are receiving. I have talked with many people who are, and we saw this in the survey you guys did, who are saying no news after 5 p.m. because I don't want COVID nightmares, and this is making me not sleep, and I need to balance the messages and the sort of negative to positive news cycle that I can see. I also want you to think about how your mood is impacting others and if you're creating a virtuous or a vicious cycle around you. Next slide. So we have to balance our stress and recovery in order to be positive and resilient. And let me just talk a little bit about that. So stress gets a bad name, but stress in and of itself is not terrible for us because it's our stimulus for growth. I've spoken with many, many leaders who say, I'm at my best when I'm challenged, but not overly fearful. So stress is where we grow. It's our stimulus for growth, but we also need recovery. And that's when the actual growth occurs. And if we have high levels of stress without recovery, then we actually can't grow. And so it's not so much of, I think everyone thinks of how do I get rid of stress? And I think very few of us think of, well, how do I grow my periods of recovery? And the most important words on this slide are fully engaged and fully disengaged. That means like not somewhat disengaged. I'm watching a movie with my significant other, but still checking my email, or putting my kids to bed, but still replaying what happened during my day. It's really fully disengaged if we want growth. You can think about this the way you would think about like lifting weights. That when we're lifting weights, we're actually we're breaking down a muscle fiber, and we need that time off, that recovery for the muscles to grow. We would never try to spend 24 hours a day in lifting weights. We would destroy our bodies. It's the same with emotional energy as well, that we need that time for recovery too. Next slide. So what are some specific approaches for recovery? Number one, you got to balance what's going into your body. So we know lean protein, complex carbohydrates every 3 to 4 hours. We also know that in this world of Zoom and working from home, we're not moving. Every 30 to 45 minutes, you need to move around, at least small movements and stretching. Every 90 to 20 minutes is when you need large movements or exercise of some kind. Get up, go for a walk, change your environment. We also cannot focus in more than 90-minute increments. In fact, if you could give yourself 60 to 90 minutes a day for pure focus on one topic where you really get into it, you will find yourself to be more productive. And we got to sleep. Lack of sleep makes us stupid. We get sloppier in our thinking, our decision-making decreases, and we get more irrational and more irritable when we don't get our sleep. Next slide. And then finally, we can work on putting a few specific practices in place to build our positive brain. This work comes from Sean Aker, who wrote the book, The Happiness Advantage. And in his research, he found it takes 21 days to create the habits of building your positive muscles. First practice, start each day with recognition. Before you get into your daily grind of emails, think about, who do I have gratitude for? Who showed up for me at a meeting yesterday in a way that meant something to me? Who was kind to me? Who has been there for me? Who really stepped out of their comfort zone? And send an email, leave a voicemail, give a quick call. It will change not only your day, for more of the positive, but you will absolutely impact somebody else's day. I've already talked about the 2 minutes of meditation, 10 minutes of daily exercise, and then these two practices are proven to make you feel more positive. Number one, the end of your day, take 3 minutes of daily journaling on meaning. What does that mean? Find one thing during your day that had personal meaning for you. In the midst of all your tasks, what really connected to your purpose, to your strengths, or to your care or concern for others, and just write unedited on it for 3 minutes. And then write down 3 specific gratitudes that you have for that day. And it's not something general like my kids. It's something specific that happened in the day with your children or with yourself or with your friends or with your work. And I suggest to people that they get a journal to put these last 2 pieces in. It's not the book where the little notebook where you write down your to-do list or your shopping list, that you keep this journal and look back at it. The reason these are so powerful is twofold. One is you're teaching your brain to search for meaning and positivity. You're actually rewiring your brain. Secondly, you're reliving the events that gave you the first sort of dopamine hit, the first positivity hit in your brain, and you get to do them all over again. Next slide. And then finally, I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes on, if we are more positive ourselves, how do we help others through change? So next slide. First thing is, we have to be able to recognize, go up that pyramid of emotional intelligence and see how others are doing. So it's really important that we recognize how people are dealing with change emotionally. So this research, is old and comes from grief research, and it shows the change curve, what happens to us when something impacts us, a change comes to us that we didn't choose and we think is bad. And, I can see this in myself as I've been through the pandemic. My middle son was getting his master's degree in Italy. So I feel like I went through this before many of my friends in the United States because, by the beginning of February, we went through this cycle of shock that this was happening around him, denial that it was going to change his life, a lot of frustration around, could we get him home? What would this mean? Depression around the impact that was going to have for him before we could work our way up the curve. So step 1, notice where people are at. Next. Step 2 is the way we help others through change is by helping them get to commitment. And we have to work with others to get them up that commitment curve. I think one of the mistakes lots of leaders make when they're trying to help others through change is they think, I've told you, you're aware, why aren't you on board? And it's because we do not get to commitment without going through these other stages first. So step 1, we need to tell people that the change is coming. Step 2, we have to help them understand what it means for them and to help them to personalize it. And step 3 is then hopefully they can buy into that change and get their head around what it means. And it's not until they have a chance to do that that they will fully commit. So what can we do to get people to commit? Number 1, listen and show empathy. Ask people how they are feeling. Share with them that you have empathy for what they're going through. Listen to their needs. Listen to their suggestions. I work with a client who reports to a CEO, and they've had a terrible relationship. She feels that he micromanages her. She feels that he undermines her. And at the beginning of this pandemic, he showed a different side of himself to her. Her husband lost his job. She lost a family friend, and he has shown up with listening and empathy, and it has completely reframed her story of who he is as a human being. You also have to prepare people for change, give them lots of opportunity to get prepared. Please be transparent with folks. We are all a bit cynical. We're looking for spin. We don't want to be told a pretty picture if that's not the truth. We don't want people to not treat us as adults who can handle the situation. And then finally, you need to let people brainstorm opportunity and find some quick wins. I know for me personally, thinking about my own business, the first thing I wanted to do after I recognized what was happening here is to figure out what could we change about our business model that is so focused on face-to-face team sessions and leadership programs, and finding some really quick wins around doing sessions online and changing our model made me feel so much more in control. Next slide. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is how do you help inspire opportunity in others when they're facing change? And one thing is, what do you do when people come to you with ideas? I love this concept from What If Innovation called greenhousing, and they talk about how new ideas are really fragile, just like young plants. You can't just put young plants oftentimes out in the yard. They have to grow it first in a greenhouse where you can control the environment and really nurture and help them. And it's the same thing with new ideas, that new ideas, depending on what are the first words that come out of your mouth, either die on the vine or really can be grown and helped along. And what you say first not only impacts what happens with that idea, but also truly impacts, is somebody going to come to you with another idea as well, ever, or are they going to avoid that? Next slide. So I just want you to think about, what do you do when someone comes to you with an idea? We know that the vast majority of new ideas are not good on their own, but they might have goodness in them if we had the opportunity to listen to them just a little bit and work with them. So are you an idea zapper, where you say, yeah, but, or we've tried that before, or we don't have time for that, or I don't think that could work, or resources are scarce, or my favorite, that's fine in theory, but? Or are you an idea booster, where you say, tell me more. How did you get that idea? What do you think that could accomplish? What would it look like? Let's play with it for a little while. This is a time where people need to be inspired to have new ways of thinking and creativity, and you can really impact them. Next slide. And then finally, just remember that as adults, it is hard for us to get out of our comfort zone and learn new things. What happens to us is that we love doing things well and having high confidence. And so we will stay with the old way of doing something until we absolutely can't. And that's what's happening to all of us right now. It would be lovely if we could just, move from the comfort zone to that new skill without going through a learning period where we feel like a beginner and we don't know what we're doing and we lack confidence, but we can't. And so they call the learning period the pain box for a reason. We have to help people keep going through that pain box and tell them it's okay to be a beginner again. And with that, I'll turn it over to Linda to wrap up.
So you will be receiving a resiliency worksheet that will be kind of a reminder of the things that we've talked about today. I would encourage you to complete that worksheet and then to choose someone to have a conversation with, to share your reflections, to pick out perhaps the top 2 or 3 where your resiliency might be challenged, and just brainstorm some ways that you can address that and have some accountability to really working on your resiliency. And then the last thing is, in a pre-pandemic world, we've seen some really interesting ways in which people have responded to how they were challenged. Back in New York, they were told that they couldn't take dogs on the subway anymore unless the dogs could fit in a bag. So here we go. Here's how New Yorkers responded to that. Just remembering that necessity is, in fact, the mother of invention. So how can you deal with the challenges that are in front of you? And what can you invent for yourself to really build that resiliency? So with that, we'll hand it over for Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Audrey and Linda. Hey guys, Nadia here. So we have some really great questions that came in. I also do want to be cognizant of the time, and we may not be able to get to everyone's questions, but we will try to address them all, hopefully in an upcoming blog or an email. So don't fear, we will get to your question if we haven't been able to on this webinar. All right, so the first question, which is actually two that came in, is around introverts and extroverts. So I want to direct this to Audrey. So the question is, as an introvert, I have found some solace in disconnecting at times, but I also want to make sure I'm there for some of my more extroverted friends that crave more constant connection. How can I find a balance of both of these things without isolating myself, but also not being on back-to-back Zooms and phone calls? And I think we can kind of couple that with another question that came in around this, which is, for introverts, how can they be more comfortable with striking up conversation that isn't just around talking about COVID?
Those are absolutely great questions. So I think for introverts, the first thing that is really important is you do need some downtime, and oftentimes introverts need preparation time. Being on constant meetings does not give them time, not only for others, but just to prepare and think for themselves. And it can be difficult to show up as your best self with your best ideas if you don't have some preparation time. So do not feel that you are being selfish if you need some regrouping time. Do what you know helps you. For lots of introverts, I think that might be some exercise, going on some walks, just doing something that does allow them to disconnect. When you are engaging with others, I know many, many introverts, they're wonderful listeners. And what I think they do that they might not recognize is incredibly valuable to extroverts is they listen so intently. They're incredible observers, and they demonstrate their empathy. Empathy doesn't mean you have to solve others' problems. I love how introverts they're not always the ones to say, well, oh yeah, that reminds me of the time when this happened to me. They just listen so selflessly. So use those skills. You're helping others more than you know. Linda, anything you'd add?
No, I think you covered it.
Wonderful. Okay, this next question I'll direct to Linda. So can the amygdala be stronger, bigger, or different person to person, or is it consistent for everyone?
So it's, again, a great question. I once had a client, after I shared this information with him, say to me, oh my God, I don't think my amygdala is the size of an almond. I think it's the size of a grapefruit. So the biological answer is no, our amygdalas are all pretty much the same size. And just that, the size of an almond. I think what differentiates people in their ability to manage their amygdala is just that level of self-awareness around what creates a trigger. And how they respond to it. And I think that the tips that we had on stopping a hijack really are a place for people to start. If you think your amygdala is as big as a grapefruit, trust me, it's not. It's the same size as mine. I just have the benefit of practicing a lot more often, perhaps, and because I'm aware of this than others might in terms of how I manage my emotional response. So practice, look at the tips and practice, and you'll get there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. All right. I think the last question I'll ask, since I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, is around parenting. Do you have any tips on how to maintain a sense of calm with kids at home while experiencing worry and uncertainty? Audrey, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I think that some of the same kind of tips that we use for ourselves really work with children. The first is truly being present, recognizing the impact of your mood on others. I had a client in tears with me last week who said that her family had said to her, please stop being so mean to us. And she had no idea that her moods from her stress were impacting others. Children really pick up on if we're fully engaging and listening to them, and showing our concern and our empathy, trying to build some normalcy into their lives as much as you can, in terms of routines, the structure, making sure that they have some things that feel as normal as possible. Don't forget about, their sort of social needs as well. We have to be creative in that right now. And then I think, some balance of honesty that's appropriate for the age, but also optimism and some kind of purpose for the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Like I said, we got a ton of other great questions. We're definitely going to try to, address those in a follow-up. So stay tuned for that. And for now, I'm going to hand it over to Jess to close us out.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And thank you, Audrey and Linda. What a way to kick off our masterclass series. Seriously, that was awesome. I heard some skills. I want to show up as my best self. So I'm really going to take some of that into my day-to-day and how I'm dealing with all of this. So from here, we have a really cool series that we will be launching. Make sure you stay connected. Pop your email into our LinkedIn group as well so that you can stay connected with the WTF group and you know what is going on. But we have a ton of great content coming out, and we appreciate the entire community for coming, joining us, and kicking this off. So thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you next time.